There are years that pass like whispers, quiet, indifferent, forgotten. But then there are years carved into time like gashes into flesh. Years where the earth groans, and the heavens themselves seem to grieve. The year 536 was not merely a moment in history, it was a curse spoken aloud by the universe. It began without warning, or perhaps the warning had been spoken for centuries, and none had listened. In the chill of a spring morning, the sun rose, but its light was ... wrong. A pale bluish disk hung in the sky, offering no warmth, no shadow, only the illusion of daylight. The people looked upward, then looked away. They did not speak of it. Perhaps they believed silence could ward off whatever evil had taken hold. But the sun did not return. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and still the light remained dim, like a candle burning behind thick glass. No shadows fell at noon. Children reached out for the warmth that never came. Mothers clutched them close, as if human heat could replace celestial fire. The skies, once a vault of gold, turned a deep gray, bruised and heavy, as if some vast wound had opened in the heavens. In Constantinople, the emperor stared through the palace windows, his hands trembling. In Rome, the senators wrapped themselves in cloaks as cold seeped through marble walls. And in distant lands, Persia, Britannia, the deserts of Africa, kings and commoners alike looked to their priests, demanding explanations. But the heavens gave none, only silence and that pale, sickly sun. And then came the ash. At first, it fell like mist, fine and silent. Then thicker, more insistent, coating roofs, fields, and the tongues of cattle. In China, records speak of a yellow dust that rained for weeks, like snow that refused to melt. In the north, crops withered in their infancy. Spring bore no fruit, summer gave no heat, autumn came with famine. The rains, too, abandoned the earth. The skies held their tears as if resentful. Boreas, the bitter wind, swept through the lands with no opposition, freezing the wheat before it could grow. Apples shriveled on their branches. Grapes soured and fell, never to ferment. The land had been cursed, it bore no child that year, and the people began to whisper. They said it was the wrath of God, or of many gods, or of something older than gods. They said the sun had died, the moon was mourning. That demons walked by day now, cloaked in the gray mist that never left. In Ireland, annals speak of breadless years. In Syria, of darkness at midday. In Scandinavia, of wolves howling endlessly at noon. Still, the ash came. The clergy urged prayer, and the people complied in knees bloodied by stone and frost. They chanted to empty skies. But heaven did not respond. And beneath the silence, something began to fester. They said famine is slow, but that is a lie. When children cry with hunger and their mothers have nothing left to give, not even milk, then death comes quickly. But worse than death was the waiting, the watching, the dread that carved itself into the bones of the living. In cities once resplendent with music and laughter, silence reigned. Bakers shuttered their ovens, markets lay bare. Coins meant nothing where there was no bread to buy. And the dead began to outnumber the living. But death was only the first of the gifts the year 536 offered. The second was madness. In times of great darkness, men search for light not merely from the sun, but from meaning. And when the heavens give none, they create it from terror. The famine, you see, did not simply empty stomachs, it hollowed minds. Hunger gnawed at thought before it gnawed at flesh. And in that emptiness, whispers began. Not from priests or poets, but from shadows. Whispers of punishment, of betrayal, of sacrifice. Across the empire, temples that once stood as monuments of hope became vaults of dread. People gathered not to pray, but to accuse. They turned on the learned men, first philosophers, astronomers, monks who had dared interpret the stars. You, they screamed, you saw it coming and said nothing. In Antioch, a bishop was stoned for failing to bring back the sun. In Carthage, a library was burned. The smoke, they believed, might feed the starving sky, and the madman thrived. They walked the streets with ash in their hair and blood on their hands, proclaiming themselves prophets. Some wore crowns of dead birds. Others drank oil and vomited flame, calling it divine revelation. One man in Thessalonica carved stars into his own skin, screaming that he was the new sun. And people listened. Because in a world where the stars no longer spoke, even the mad could seem divine. But madness, like fire, spreads. Whole villages turned to rituals, ancient, pagan, forgotten. Livestock were bled dry over frozen soil. Children were buried to appease the earth. In one coastal town, 50 men walked into the sea at night, hands clasped, chanting to the god beneath the waves. None returned. Still the sun did not rise. And in the courts of kings, the faces grew no less gaunt. The emperors had gold, yes, but what was gold now? The merchants had ships, but where was their grain to buy? Even the mighty Justinian in Byzantium, once cloaked in marble and silk, now walked through his palace like a ghost, his advisors whispering of revolt, of heresy, of pestilence. Ah, yes, the pestilence. It began, like all great horrors, in silence, cough, a fever, a swelling. Then the screams. They said it came from the sea, borne on ships, whose sails were made not of cloth, but of rotting skin, that rats carried it, that demons rode its breath. But no one truly knew. What they did know was this: it killed without mercy. It killed without logic. A man could walk through the city gates laughing, and by nightfall his body would be oozing black from the armpits and groin. Children died cradled in their mother's arms. Mothers died mid-lullaby. And Priso, the priest, died in the sanctuaries, calling for a god that would not answer. Some swore the disease was a punishment. Others said it was the world rotting from within. But there was no cure, no reprieve, only fire and graves. And yet the bodies began to outnumber the shovels, so they stopped burying them. In Constantinople, carts rolled through the streets like grim processions, piled with corpses. When the cemeteries filled, they threw the dead into the sea. But the sea, mocking in its own cruelty, returned them, bloated, pale, eyeless. Even the rats, it was said, began to starve. Inside homes, the lucky starved, the unlucky lived. In the fevered delirium, they saw things, creatures with no eyes, voices that spoke in dreams, names that should not be known. Some called it hallucination, others, revelation. Either way, it hollowed the soul, and those who survived did not emerge whole. Fathers forgot their children. Lovers recoiled from each other. The dead lay for weeks beside the living, untouched, because to touch was to die. The air itself became suspect. The light, if one could call it, that seemed thick, bruised with rot. One historian wrote, "I would rather have been born blind than see the world as it was in those days." And still the sun refused to shine. By the third year, the world had grown quiet, not peaceful, but stunned. Like the silence that follows a scream so loud it breaks the mind. The cities, once humming with commerce, laughter, and deceit, now reeked of abandonment and rot. Doors creaked endlessly in the wind. Streets were littered with broken things, shattered amphorae, torn sandals, bones half gnawed by dogs. The dogs, too, were starving. In Rome, a woman wandered naked through the Forum, her hair crawling with lice, her arms cradling a sack of dead rats like infants. In Antioch, flocks of crows gathered on the spires of churches, cawing sermons to an empty congregation. In Alexandria, the Nile ran dark, not with blood but with ink, as scribes cast their manuscripts into the water in despair, believing knowledge had damned them. But worst of all was Byzantium. The empire's beating heart turned black. The great city had become a tomb. Justinian, the once golden emperor, now shuffled like a ghost through palace halls where tapestries hung like funeral shrouds. He, too, had caught the plague. For days, the court held its breath. Would the divine ruler perish like a common beggar? He did not, but something in him did. They said when Justinian rose from his sick bed, he no longer cast a shadow, that he stared too long at fire, that he spoke to statues and waited for them to answer. Perhaps the fever had left his mind scorched, like the fields outside the city. Or perhaps surviving the hand of God broke what little humanity remained in him. In the streets, the situation grew desperate. Gravediggers stopped digging out from apathy, but exhaustion. There were simply too many bodies. Soldiers were sent to collect the dead, then slaves, then anyone still breathing. The towers of the city once used for defense became vertical charnel pits. Roofs were torn off, corpses thrown in by the thousands, the roofs nailed back down like lids on coffins. The stench became unbearable. Even the sea breeze, once a relief, now carried the perfume of mass death. Trade collapsed. Not from economics, but from fear. No merchant wished to dock in a harbor haunted by death. No messenger dared ride out from a plague-stricken city. What news escaped was distorted by dread, soaked in superstition. Maps were redrawn not by geography, but by rumor. Whole regions were marked not as hostile, but as unholy. And in the absence of bread, men devoured each other. Cannibalism, once a word reserved for the far, savage corners of myth, became whispered reality. Mothers who had outlived their children now boiled their bones for marrow. In one village near Ephesus, a group of survivors trapped a traveling monk and tore him apart. Believing his flesh carried holy warmth, they ate his hands first, for they were closest to God. Religion did not perish, but it mutated. Gods multiplied like tumors. Some worshipped the plague, offering it tokens, teeth, hair, the eyes of the dead. Others turned back to ancient rites, burning bulls, drowning virgins, inscribing runes in blood beneath the moonless sky. In Gaul, a cult arose that believed the world had already ended, and that all who remained were damned souls. Wandering the afterlife unaware, they wore white masks. They never spoke, and yet, even in that abyss, a strange order emerged. The factions once divided by blood, politics, greedy, now buried the dead together. Men who had fought over grain now lit candles beside one another in the name of mercy. And those who had lived vile, shameful lives, thieves, heretics, defilers, began to pray, not from virtue but from terror, as if death had become the only mirror honest enough to show them their souls. One chronicler wrote, "It is not that men became good, but rather the fear of judgment taught them to imitate goodness, just in case someone was watching. But who was watching? The sky remained dead, the stars dim, the moon a pale scab in the heavens, the sun a sick ghost, and then something stranger still began to unfold. There were those who did not die, not because they were immune, but because they were ... spared. The worst of men, liars, tyrants, murderers, somehow endured, while saints and innocents withered. A cruel arithmetic governed the plague. A merchant who had poisoned his own brother survived, only to find himself buried alive beneath his own collapsed house. A general who had sacked a holy temple lived, but spent his remaining days gnawing his own hands. It was as if the plague had a will, not random, not blind, but deliberate, selective, mocking, as if somewhere in the smoke-choked heavens something ancient watched and chose. And so the world stumbled into the final act of its slow annihilation. It's not with fire, nor with trumpet blasts of divine reckoning, but with a whisper cold, persistent, and incurable. The whisper of a question no priest, no emperor, no philosopher could answer. Why us? By the fourth year, no one asked what the plague was. They asked who it was. Because somewhere between the dying sun and the dying earth, belief had warped. People no longer saw the plague as a disease, but as a presence, something with a mind, with judgment, with taste. They began to call it names, the old breath. The pale father, the fifth horseman, the orphan god. They prayed not to be healed, but to be ignored. And yet it remembered. Villages that once turned away starving strangers found themselves forgotten by the rains. Fields dried to dust. Wells turned black. Those who drank from them began to see things, withered hands reaching from the corners of rooms, the faces of their dead speaking in reverse. Even the animals knew. Dogs howled at midday. Crows circled in patterns too perfect. In one monastery, a monk recorded that the goats would not drink water unless it was carried in a human skull. He died 4 days later smiling, and the children, they stopped being born. Not from lack of trying, but the wombs grew cold. Mothers wept blood. And those few infants that survived arrived in silence, eyes open, black as ink, and utterly still. Some breathed. Some did not. None cried. One bishop declared this mercy. Another hanged himself in the bell tower, claiming he had seen the Antichrist crawling beneath the skin of his grandchild. Hope became an antique emotion. Even the Emperor Justinian, the unbroken, could no longer pretend the empire would survive. He sat in his chamber, surrounded by scrolls no one would ever read again. Maps of provinces that no longer answered his letters. Treaties with kings long dead. Taxes from towns that had become cemeteries. He wrote decrees into the air with his finger, forgetting there was no one left to read them. His final act of governance was neither war nor law. It was silence. He ceased to speak altogether. Outside the palace, Byzantium rotted. Ivy crept across the faces of statues. Temples filled with crows. The hippodrome was used to burn bodies. The libraries, the greatest collection of knowledge in the known world, were sealed shut, in case the pages themselves carried the plague, or worse, its memory. But memory cannot be sealed. The survivors, scattered, feral, half-mad, became the true inheritors of this era. They did not rebuild, they did not write. They remembered. They told stories in whispers, beside dying fires, of the sky that turned to iron, of the year with no sun, of the children born without names, and of the time when God turned his face away. Some say the world ended in the year 536. Others argue it was only the beginning of a longer death. But no one denies what came afterward felt like something less than living. And the most terrifying part, it never truly ended. For the shadow that fell in that cursed year never left. It retreated, perhaps, into cracks, into bloodlines, into the forgotten corners of the soul. But it waits. It always waits. And if you listen, truly listen, you may still hear it. In the silence between breaths, in the pause before dawn, the eyes of those who remember what they were never alive to see, because some wounds do not heal, some stories do not end, and some years are never over.